Get ready to crush it. Crush it.
Yeah.
This is the Crush It Podcast with Matt and Mason.
Hello, and welcome in to the Crush It Podcast. This is Matt Davis here along with my co-host, Mr. Mason Burchett. How's it going, Mason?
Welcome in.
That wasn't the answer to my question. You decided literally after I have said welcome, you felt like you needed to welcome them in.
No, it sounded a little weird that you said welcome in, so I was actually making fun of you.
All right. Well, thanks for that.
You're welcome.
Great relationship we have here on the Crush It Podcast. So, really excited about the episode we've got for you today. There have been a couple things we've been talking about, some things we want to address, and there are some terms that have come up in past podcasts that we've talked about that we want to kind of dive into a little bit deeper, and I'm really excited about this week's podcast because I think it is a term that is used very loosely, and people have the wrong idea when it gets thrown around. And the term is be your own boss, because that is something, Mason, we've talked about, that in so many different fields and so many different pitches, they talk about being your own boss. And there's a lot of misconceptions about that idea.
Yeah, that's right. And we're going to dive into some of those misnomers and misconceptions of what it means to be your own boss. But first, let's define what being a boss even is.
Right.
Because a lot of people have the wrong idea of what it even means to be a boss.
Right. And we're not even talking about, when you use the term boss, people are like, oh, that means I'm the greatest. My little boy, anytime he's good at anything, he always, Dad, I'm boss at this. And, the humility on that kid is just
takes after his father.
Fantastic. But anyway, so, if you just simply, a lot of times in day-to-day life, the meaning of a word kind of gets lost, lost in translation a little bit. But if you go look up that word boss, it literally just means a person in charge of an organization. So what we want to look at today is kind of what that means. If we take the definition of a boss and we compare that and make it relevant to be your own boss, what that would mean for us. If you are in charge of an organization, and we're looking at our body, at ourselves as that organization, an organization is simply an organized body with a particular purpose. So, we could really spend an entire podcast talking about purpose and having a purpose. That's not what we're doing today. But for you to be your own boss means that you are going to have to control, and we're going to get a little bit more into this, but you're going to have to take care of that organization and make sure that you are focused on a purpose and that you are fighting towards that. Now, just a second ago, Mason, you mentioned that there's a lot of misnomers about being your own boss. There's some preconceived ideas that when you hear that phrase, people automatically think, oh, awesome, if I'm my own boss, that means da-da-da-da. So why don't you kind of go over that a little bit, some of the misconceptions and misnomers that come along with that phrase when people hear, hey, you can be your own boss.
Yeah, on the outset, I think that a lot of that stems from negative connotations of what it even means to be a boss. So in the leadership world, we shed a lot of negative light on the word boss.
True.
So we like to opt for words like leader and other more
politically correct.
Sure. More organizationally correct, more team-friendly words.
Right.
But I think that they've built the whole phrase of be your own boss to play off of the emotional connection that people have with that word. Because when people think of their boss, they think of someone who fusses at them for being late.
Right.
Somebody that's telling them to get back to work, getting on to them for being on their phone, getting on to them for not meeting a goal. That it's the guy that's in charge of you that you feel like you're working hard to make him money. That's kind of what the emotional connection, the mental association is with that word. And so people are like, man, I'll
keep
be
him
my
happy.
own. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's great marketing. From a marketing perspective, it's great marketing for people to say you could be your own boss if you do this or this.
Right.
It's a marketing scheme, which is great. They did a great job with that keyword. But the problem is, like you said, a lot of people have a misconception of what it means to be a boss.
Right.
So a lot of the sales pitch behind being your own boss is you can sleep in, you can set your own hours, you can work in your PJs.
Right.
Choose when you want to work, take off whenever you want to, and that's the attractive setting.
Go ahead. Welcome back, Mason. Good to have you on the podcast today.
That's the kind of table that is set for people that makes it attractive for them to be their own boss.
Right. And I think the danger of that really, because a lot of the statements you just made, okay, there are a lot of industries where, if you're working online, a lot of times you can do it in your pajamas, right?
Sure.
There is some flexibility and some freedom in being able to, depending on what industry you're in, 100%, being able to maybe decide which hours you do work, the amount of hours, because a lot of times the conception, whether it's actually verbalized or not, what we're dealing with is perception, right? Because in reality, perception is reality. Okay, we get that. And so people get the mindset, hey, I can just work 2 hours a day. I decide what 2 hours that is, and I'm going to make a truckload of money. When the reality is there are some positive aspects to the fact that, you don't always have to be in a 3-piece suit with a lot of these industries. You don't always have to be up at a certain time, go to bed at a certain time. You can decide what hours you work. There are elements of truth to that, but the reality is when people get the wrong mindset and they think, you know what, all I have to do is give a couple hours a day and I'm going to be super successful. It's very misleading when the reality is if you are going to be your own boss, that means the boss that you're leaving in your 9 to 5 or whatever the case may be, what he meant to you, you have to now be to yourself.
Yeah, and I think just to back up and reiterate what you're saying, the fact that working in your pajamas, working as minimal hours as you can, if those are the attractive things to you,
you don't need to be your own boss.
Then that's automatic. Yeah, that is automatically a signal that you do not need to be your own boss.
You do not have the hustle.
Right.
You do not have the drive.
Because could you work in your PJs all day? Sure, you could. And this is the thing. I could get away with wearing jeans and a polo in my job every day. I could do that.
Right.
But when I dress up, it's a mental thing.
Absolutely.
It's a mental thing. I work better when I feel professional.
Not just for you
Not just
either.
for me.
It's not just a mental thing for you.
Right.
When the owner of your company or the other C-level guys see you come in.
Or the customers
Or the customers. That's exactly right. When they see you making that extra effort, it's a mindset for them too.
What you just said was perception is reality.
Exactly. And as old as it is, and we've all heard it, don't dress for the job you have, dress for the job you want.
Right.
Which explains why I'm in my Batman suit today. But the reality
the tights
is,
look great on you.
Well,
by the
thank
way.
you. I appreciate. You're the only person to say that. Friends are for lying, right? So, like Mason said, if those tiny little details that may be true in a lot of ways, if that is your determining factor, then you're probably not going to have the type of success from a be your own boss or a self-employed aspect that you think you're going to be. You're not going to see that type of success. So what we want to do for the next few minutes is kind of break down a little bit what a boss is. What does a boss do on maybe a corporate structure? Is that the right term? Corporate or like a business structure?
Sure.
Whoever you're working for. Mm-hmm. If you are going to pull away from them and say, hey, I'm going to be my own boss, what is that going to require of you? What are you going to have to do to fill the role of being the boss in your life. Why don't you get us started with that, Mason?
Yeah, I mean, so like we talked about, the most basic definition of a boss is somebody that's essentially overseeing an organization.
Right.
So if you're becoming your own boss, we're assuming that you are about to organize some sort of idea, a product. You're starting some kind of company, essentially, right? And so being your own boss means it is now your responsibility to organize that thought, that business, that product, that idea,
purpose.
whatever it is that you're going out to do, you're now in control of that. You're the manager, you're the boss of that.
Yeah.
So you have to organize that. No one else can do it for you now.
Right. And that's one of the things, probably the biggest pieces that is missed in this mindset is people forget, really, they forget to take it so as serious as they need to. Mm-hmm. Because the fact is, if you're not willing to push yourself to organize and make sure everything is done the way it's supposed to, then nobody else is there to do it for you, like before in your job where you had a boss. So some things that a boss does, what are they going to do on a day-to-day basis? Well, the most simplest of those, they're going to make sure a schedule is kept. And they're going to make sure that everybody, they fill out those schedules. They've got certain people that they expect to be there at certain times. Well, now, if you're going to be your own boss, you need to figure out your schedule. Okay, one of the biggest mistakes that people make when they decide to become their own boss is they think, okay, this is what I want to do, and this is how I'm going to do it. They don't, they forget to take the seriousness of it, and they don't schedule anything. It's like, well, I'm going to get up today, and I'm going to be successful. Okay, being successful is not a plan. Okay, that's an end goal. That's where you want to be. But if you're going to end up successful, it takes a day-to-day plan, a schedule that somebody is going to have to hold you to and make sure that you keep to get things done. And when you say, I'm going to be my own boss, you are essentially saying, hey, I'm going to make a schedule for myself and hold myself accountable to that schedule to make sure that these things get done.
You have to hold yourself to the same standard as you will eventually, hopefully, hold your employees and your team member. Right. You are your own employee at this point. You are your own team.
Yep.
So you have to, just like you get mad at the boss for yelling at you when you come in late, you have to get mad at yourself for waking up late, for not getting started on time, for procrastinating. It is your job to make sure you're being responsible for your team, even if that team is just you.
It's just you. That's exactly right. Because a boss is not going to allow you to come in 30 minutes late, to show up late, to just sleep in and not do what you're supposed to do. They're not going to let you go take a 3-hour lunch.
Sure.
I mean, that's one of the big, easiest traps. And I'm talking a lot from experience here, how easy it is when you're being your own boss to say, hey, you know what, I've had a successful morning. I'm going to go grab lunch, or I'm going to go home for lunch. I'm going to go do this. And, you go at 12 and it's 3 o'clock and you're not back to work yet. And that's one of the hardest things. We're kind of talking about character and discipline here is really what we're getting at. But what a boss does is they make sure that everybody is working during the times that they need to be working. And that's one of the most important elements I think that people miss in becoming their own boss is you need a schedule. And you need to hold yourself to that schedule. Yes, there can be some flexibility with it. It's nice when you can schedule work around one of your child's sporting events or, hey, if somebody's sick and you need to help, those are some advantages that come along with being your own boss.
Sure.
But outside of those things, because we're both, Mason, you and I are both big-time family men, and we do not want to we don't ever want to come across as saying that, hey, you should sacrifice family for business. We will never, ever, ever push that because that is not success. Okay, you can have all the money in the world and lose your family, but at the same time, one of the big traps that I have seen people fall into, and to be honest, have fallen into myself, is it's very easy when you are being your own boss to use your family as an excuse to not quite hold yourself as accountable to a schedule as you need to be. Be there for your family as you need to, but at the same time, if you're being your own boss, if it's not something, and I think this is a good rule, if it's not something that you would be comfortable calling your boss and saying, this is why I can't come in today, or this is why I can't show up. If you're not comfortable calling a boss and doing that, don't be comfortable telling yourself that. If it's a legit reason, then use that to your advantage. But you don't have to, if you're not willing to call your boss, then don't be willing to tell yourself the same excuse.
And the thing is, you can make your own schedule. That's accurate.
Right.
That is a benefit of being your own boss. But making your own schedule, people think of it in the mentality of 9 to 5. If I need to get off at 3 and go do my kids' Little League practice, I can do that. Sure, you can.
Right.
But what that means is you might have to pick work back up at 8 when you get home that night.
That's a great
You might have to finish what you're doing. Just because you got something to do at lunch, or you got something to do at 4, you can schedule around that. But that doesn't mean that you can push off the work. Like, the work still has to be done.
Right.
You've got
and
to
even
schedule in the
more
work.
Sure.
Sure.
That's actually one of the negatives that comes along with being your own boss that we forget to talk about is most of the time when you're working for a company or an organization, if you do work 9 to 5, when you clock out at 5, you're done.
Right.
You don't have to worry about it again. Now I know a lot of jobs, people have to carry them home with them, and they worry about it, blah, 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 and all that. So I know that's a factor, but the reality is you really don't have to do anything till 9 o'clock the next morning. Whereas if you're your own boss, you work till the job's done.
Right.
Whatever needs to get done for that day or for that week. You may have some flexibility on when you do those things, but the reality is they have to be done. And so that's a great point.
Because the thing is a lot of people think, like you said, they clock out at 5 and they're done.
Right.
And they assume that goes all the way to the top. But who may also clock out at 5 and not be done is your boss.
Right.
Like, if something happens after hours, somebody's got to handle it, and it's your boss.
Yeah.
And so when you're your own boss, if something happens even after your scheduled hours, guess who's in charge here?
Yeah.
You are.
Yeah, and that's something that I've even seen over the years with my friendship with you, and then some other guys who've had like general manager positions and things like that. I don't know how many times I've talked to you on like a Sunday afternoon.
Oh, yeah.
And you're at the office.
Yep.
You're having to get stuff done.
Yep.
Nobody else was there. Those other guys who weren't the boss, they didn't have to come in on Sunday, but there was a certain amount of work that had to get done, so you had to go get it done. And so when you become your own boss, you've got some flexibility, and that's great. And, most of the time, 9 times out of 10, it is worth it, okay?
Sure.
It's worth it to make that trade. But don't forget that working for a company, typically you're looking at a 40-hour work week. When you become your own boss, you can toss that out the window. I remember I saw a thing one time that said, one guy said, I had to work 50 hours this week, and the entrepreneur said, I remember my first part-time job too.
Right.
Sure. And like, that's meant to be funny, but there's so much truth to that, because if you're going to be successful as your own boss, then it is going to take some longer hours. It's going to take more time, because it's not about the hours you work. It's about the amount of work that gets done, no matter how many hours that takes.
Because when you're your own boss, you're not just owner or CEO. Mm-hmm. You're CEO, you're general manager, your marketing, your procurement, your sales, your secretary, your accounting. You're all the things.
You're everything.
You're all the things until you get big enough to build your own staff.
Yeah.
But that's the thing I hate about work your own hours. It's deceiving. Sure, you can schedule your own hours, but a lot of times, especially if you start gaining traction, the market will schedule your hours.
Yeah.
Because you have to be proactive.
In so many industries, and this is a statement that I've heard you make so many times, the customer decides your hours.
That's right.
And you're right about that, because, if I'm in a service industry, that I've started, and I'm my own boss. If I am in any type of industry where I have a customer base on a day-to-day basis, there is always the risk that, hey, that phone's going to ring.
Right.
And if you're going to be successful as a business owner, you got to answer that phone 100% of the time. And whatever the issue is, you got to deal with it, because it don't just go away. One of the jokes that goes around with amongst employees is, the boss's number popping up and hitting ignore.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't get to do that
Right.
when you're your own boss.
Yep.
You may be your own boss, but the reality is a lot of times every one of your customers is your boss.
It's true.
And,
Yeah.
and you can't hit ignore on that. But that's a luxury that you are giving up, being able to just ignore phone calls when you're your own boss.
Yeah, because like you said, no one's ever truly their own boss.
Right.
Especially
a married man.
That's exactly right. But even look at the giants of industry. Elon Musk, he's not his own boss.
Right.
His boss is Tesla consumers.
Right.
Tim Cook, CEO of Apple, he's not his own boss.
Right.
His boss is iPhone consumers and Mac consumers. So the consumer will always be your boss.
Right.
And that's something that people who want to quote unquote be their own boss have to keep in mind. Even the highest C-suite level, the top grossing companies in the world, the CEOs of those companies aren't even their own boss.
Right.
The consumer's always in charge.
Absolutely. So let's kind of move on from that as far as talking about bosses. You got to make sure a schedule's kept. Set a schedule. Make sure you keep it. And then we talked a little bit about excuses. Look, if it's not an excuse that you would be willing to call the manager of the business you worked for and give them that excuse, don't tell yourself it's a good enough excuse either. Don't accept excuses from yourself. Legitimate reasons come that things don't get done, okay? Things come up in life. And like I said, one of the benefits of being your own boss is that when those things come up, you can kind of adjust things around it. But if you're just making excuses, don't try to feed yourself that own line when you wouldn't tell the owner of a company that same line if you worked for him. I saw a thing a while back that said, "I don't have time" is the adult equivalent of "the dog ate my homework."
Right.
Because it's something we love to use.
Yep.
Listen, don't accept that excuse from yourself, okay? Manage that time. Set your schedule. Do what you've got to do to make sure those works get done. A boss's job is to not only make sure a schedule is kept, but to limit those excuses, okay?
That's right.
And so if you're going to be your own boss, you got to set that schedule, but you got to limit those excuses, okay? Don't accept those excuses from yourself. If you wouldn't accept them from somebody else, if somebody else made the statement and you would know and you'd see right through it, don't accept those excuses for yourself.
Well, in any organized company, any traditional business structure where somebody may be working right now or the 9-to-5 that you just left probably has a policy on how many tardies you can have,
right,
how many absences you can have.
Yep.
And they have that because there are legitimate reasons sometimes that you have to miss work.
Yep.
But the truth is those are few and far between.
Yep.
And there's been enough record over the hundreds of years of business to show that people will make up anything to get out of work.
No.
Yeah, believe it or not. And if you put yourself in charge, like you're saying, it's a lot easier to make those excuses because who's going to punish you?
Right. Well, and the reality is what a lot of people don't realize, the reason this is so important is because the punishment is in the long term.
Right.
That's where you're going to pay the price.
Well, the punishment's in the success or failure of your business.
Exactly. And not being able to reach the full potential that you could have if you didn't allow yourself to make those excuses. So moving on a little bit, and this is something that Mason, I kind of want you to take the lead on because it is such an important piece of this, and coming from your background, I think you'll be able to add a lot of value here. Another job, another responsibility of the boss is to prioritize the responsibilities within the business. And if you're going to be your own boss, there is a huge element of, hey, I've got to prioritize what needs to be done, when it needs to be done, how it needs to be done, and making these different responsibilities. Talk a little bit about how to prioritize those.
Yeah, there's a element in business management that we call the 4 quadrants of time management. And I'd encourage people to go look up the 4 quadrants of time management. That's not what this episode's about, but it's super relevant. And essentially what it comes down to is there are important things that need to be done, but they may not be urgent things. And so one of the biggest issues that I faced in my time as operations management, and even that I have to manage myself over, is prioritizing my day, prioritizing my responsibilities. There are plenty of things that need to get done that are important to the business's success,
right?
But they may not need to be done right now. These may be in a month from now things. These may be next week things. And there are more urgent responsibilities that need to be done immediately. For example, I may need to finish Q3 sales reports to be able to submit those so we can forecast sales for the next quarter, right? At the same time, I just had a machine that broke down. So both of these things are important. It is important that I'm able to forecast our sales for the next quarter.
Right.
But currently, our method of manufacturing is not working. Both things are important. One of those is urgent. One of those is not. And this is an easy choice of prioritizing responsibilities. But this trickles down all the way into a smaller scale of being your own boss. You could be working on something right now that very well could wait until next week. Right. There could be something very urgent that you need to work on right now, such as a bad customer review or somebody that's placed an order and you're worried about marketing or something else.
Right.
And you need to be prioritizing your responsibilities to deal with the thing that is most urgent.
Right. Which really a lot of this, and this is not something that we've covered yet, but a lot of this comes back to, if you're going to be your own boss, you're setting out a business plan. You're planning things out. You're making a list of these priorities, which is so important, and making sure you're following them. And I think that where a lot of people fail, especially when they jump into their own business type situation, is they don't write things down. Because I may be going up the road today, and I come up with this great business plan in my mind about something, and this is what I'm going to do, this is how I'm going to execute it, this is what needs to be done in this order, and then tomorrow I'm going up the road, and I can't remember exactly what I thought of yesterday, and I come up with a whole new business plan. And I think that's where a lot of people end up staying so confused in their business plans and in prioritizing those responsibilities, is because it's so important that you write things down, that you hold yourself accountable to these responsibilities, whatever the plan is that's related to what you're doing. Write it down, prioritize how these things need to be done, and then refer to that list multiple times a day to make sure, hey, is what I'm doing right now the most important thing to be done right now?
Yeah, and in a lot of organizations, value of work seems to be measured by time spent and not by results produced. And that's a mentality that a lot of people get in.
Yeah.
But there are plenty of studies that show, real-world studies. I'm thinking of one, and I can't remember the name of the book that this came from. But it was a study where they had a certain amount of tasks to be done in, I think it was like 70 or 80 hours, and then those same tasks that were supposed to be done in 30 hours. Both of them got done in their specific amounts of time because a deadline was given and schedules were made.
Right.
So in that 80-hour scenario, there was a lot more filler time. People felt like they could be a little more laid back. There wasn't that sense of urgency. They felt like they could take more time doing the tasks that needed to be done.
Right.
Those guys with 30 hours, they felt
they
the
got
sense
the work
of urgency.
done.
They had to hustle to get it done.
Right.
Both sides got it done in two different amounts of time. And that just goes to show that time spent does not always represent value. You could spend 2 days doing something that really needed to take you 6 hours to get done.
Right.
And you think you've done a lot of work.
Yeah.
But really, it's just bad scheduling. So That's where we go back to prioritizing your responsibilities and that first point of making a schedule
Right.
for yourself and making sure you get those things done in order in the most efficient time possible.
Yeah, that's good. So now, overall, as a boss, we've talked about all these details, and we're starting to wind down just a little bit. But really, what a boss does is they want to maintain a direction. You decide the business plan, you write it down, you get your schedule, but the whole point is to make sure the business stays and maintains the direction that it needs to go. What are some ways that an individual looking at it from a business standpoint and breaking it down a little bit more into a be your own boss scenario, ways that you can make sure that you're maintaining, just maybe like a daily check to make sure you're maintaining that direction?
Yeah, in any organizational structure, whether that be a corporate setting or you being your own boss, you have to have, in the corporate world, they're called KPIs, key performance indicators. Mm-hmm. This has been commercialized a lot into what's called SMART goals,
right?
Specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, time-based. And essentially what SMART goals are, or KPIs are, is a way for you to measure success.
Okay.
So if you could be spending a lot of time doing a lot of things, but if it's not making you and your business more successful, you're wasting your time.
Absolutely.
And so it's important that you set measurable goals that show you whether or not what you're doing is being successful. And I can't tell you what success looks like because that varies per industry and varies
per person,
whatever you're doing. We talked about that in our first podcast episode about defining success for yourself.
Right.
And once you've defined your success, it's extremely important that you set up goals that are attainable. They need to be challenging,
right,
but not unrealistic. Challenging goals that are attainable that allow you to measure your success as you grow. Okay.
So that's something that, we've talked about a little bit, and everybody's different when it comes to this space. Mm-hmm. Okay. For me, I slightly disagree with the statement you just made about attainable goals. And now, this does vary from person to person.
Sure.
Some people, in order to be successful, they have to set a goal that they know they can reach so that they can reach it and then set their next goal.
Sure.
Some of us, and this is kind of where I fall, I like to set unrealistic goals. I like to set just goals that are just way out of reach, because my mindset is, and maybe this is a little bit of an exception, but my mindset is that if I set a crazy goal and I work myself to death to reach that goal, then I'm going to be pretty happy with where I land between here and there. Now, that's not how everybody works. A lot of people feel like, hey, if I set a crazy goal, I'm going to know that I'm never going to reach that goal, so why even try? And so there's different mindsets here. But what I like about what you're saying, to bring that around, no matter which one of those you fall in, there have to be some guidelines, some goals, like you just said, that are set to where you can measure your success as a personal business owner. And I like that because although my goals may be crazy goals, I can't measure myself by a crazy goal.
Yeah.
I have to measure myself by, okay, this is where I'm at, this is what I'm doing. So that's where a little bit of a balance in your mindset, you may be listening to this and you hear, okay, an attainable goal, yeah, that sounds good, that's how I can roll. But you might also be here, your mindset, because when I hear people say attainable goals, I'm like, ugh, gross.
Sure.
That's my mindset. And so that may be you. You may hear that and think, this isn't, that's not how I roll. I want big, crazy goals. And that's okay to have those big, crazy goals. But what I'm saying is allow yourself to be balanced in that mindset. And I guess I'm mainly talking to those who like to set the crazy goals. Uh-huh. Allow yourself to be balanced in that mindset, because there has to be an element of attainable goals lined out in your business plan so that you can measure that success.
The reason, and let me clarify my statement there, and it could be that goals is the wrong word for what I'm talking about. I said that in a corporate setting we call them key performance indicators.
Yeah.
It's because they're not necessarily goals. Like you're saying, maybe it's the more loose definition that's been given. Goals is a hot button. It's a hot word.
It's
a key word.
Yeah, for sure.
And it means different things to different people. And so I totally get the reach for the stars setting goals. But as far as a KPI, an attainable goal goes, as you're building a business and being your own boss from an operational standpoint, you have to consider payroll. You have to consider inventory cost. You have to consider operating cost, marketing budget. Those are all things you have to think about.
Right.
And you have to have a certain amount of revenue to justify those expenses. It's called balancing a budget.
Yeah.
And so that said, you have to have a goal that must be reached. It's an attainable goal. Sure, have an unrealistic goal to shoot for the star, but there is a mathematical equation that will give you a number that you have to reach for your business to be operational. Yeah. And that's what I'm talking about as far as setting those smart, attainable goals.
That makes perfect sense. That makes perfect sense. So I guess, kind of as we're wrapping up here, we've talked a lot about being your own boss. That's kind of been the theme here today. And we don't in any way want this to sound like we have put out a podcast disagreeing with being your own boss, because it's quite the opposite. If you can do it, we highly recommend it. But what we want to do, the purpose of this is just kind of to keep us all in check here, to say, hey, if we're going to be our own boss, what does that really mean? Don't get caught up in the hype of the mindset that be your own boss, everything's perfect. This is going to be easy. Sure. I'm going to quit my job, go home, and money's going to start rolling in. I'm my own boss. And here's the thing, and I'm not being hard on any company that, and you may have a different view on this, but I'm not even being hard on any company that uses that phrase when they're talking to people, because the reality is that if somebody in most of these industries and most of these opportunities where they say you can be your own boss, if you are your own boss like we've defined today, then you are going to be successful.
That's exactly right.
And you are going to have that. But I'm afraid that we've just and I don't even know who's to blame, but there's a preconceived idea that be your own boss equals easy street. And that is just not the case. It's quite the opposite. If you are, being your own boss, that would put you in the category of an entrepreneur.
Sure.
And, like we've talked about, that's a
buzzword.
Yeah, that's a buzzword now. But an entrepreneur is not somebody who says, who gets to enjoy the high life without having to work for it. An entrepreneur is somebody who says, you know what, I'm going to get out of the rat race and I'm going to build an empire for myself. And if that takes 80, 100 hours a week to do it, then so be it. I'm going to pay the price. And so, just don't allow yourself to fall into this false mindset that being your own boss is just a stroll down easy street with a big bank account. I highly recommend it. Be your own boss.
Absolutely.
Do it. Pay that price, but realize there is a price to be paid.
Yeah, and on the outset of that, I would encourage people to look up real-world examples of people that have done it.
Yeah.
People like Dave Ramsey, Mark Cuban, Zuckerberg even. Yeah. These are guys that started out small, had multiple failures when they were starting up. But, man, and they're living the life now, but these guys hustled, made an enormous amount of sacrifice. They really put the definition behind the word entrepreneur. Like we said, it's a buzzword, and it means a lot of different things to different people now.
Right.
But true entrepreneurs are people that made enormous amounts of sacrifice to build the businesses to be what they are today.
Yeah, because if you look at, all we see of these these large businesses that are so successful, you've got your Amazon, your Google, all of these companies that are just billion-dollar companies now, and we just see they're successful. If you do any research into where they started, half these successful businesses started in garages. I don't know. Have you seen the picture of Jeff Bezos in like an apartment
Yep.
with Amazon spray painted on the wall.
Right.
You know, like that's what it took. I mean, right now we see him as, you know, this billionaire and how successful he is. But the reality is, if we knew how many hours a week he worked at the beginning of this, it would blow our minds.
In
You know?
almost every scenario, there's also a string of failed businesses that are preceding the ones that are now
You
successful.
can't have success without failure.
That's right.
That is part of it.
Experience is a great
And so-
teacher.
Absolutely. And so to be your own boss, it would probably blow our minds if we knew the percentage of how few people were actually successful the first time they said, I'm going to be my own boss. It would probably blow our minds how few people have actually seen success on their first try, because it takes multiple failures to get there. And so, you know, being your own boss is a beautiful thing. And especially when you're playing long ball, it's going to work out in your favor. When you're looking at the long run, and you pay the price now so that you can enjoy the benefits of that later, be your own boss is the way to go. Whether that is through some sort of internet business, internet-based business, whether it is through a self-employed service business, whatever the case is, make sure that you understand the purpose of being your own boss, what that actually means. Define that, and then decide, this is what I'm going to do to make sure I see that success long term. Go after that. Be your own boss. Do what you got to do, but just realize that there is a price to be paid if you're going to live that life.
All right, guys, that's going to wrap it up for this one. We appreciate everybody that subscribed to the podcast, followed us, and is hanging out with us here on the podcast and on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Again, if you want to look us up, our handle is at Do The Doubt on Facebook and Instagram, and at _Do The Doubt on Twitter. You can find the podcasts most places that podcasts are distributed by looking up the Crush It Podcast or going to crushitpodcast.com.
And tell somebody about us. We'd appreciate it. Let us know what you think. You know, respond. We would love to interact with you guys. Tell us what you think about the podcast that we have recorded up to this point. Maybe if you have any suggestions on future content, we'd definitely love to hear from you. And whatever you're doing, however you do it, from us here at the Crush It Podcast, the only thing we have to say is crush it.
Down and down and down and down.